Norah O'Donnell on Secretary of State Antony Blinken.
This week on 60 Minutes, we spoke with Secretary of State Antony Blinken. He told us China is the biggest foreign policy challenge facing America and threatens the rules-based international order.
When we see any country that is challenging that order or trying to undermine it, we're going to stand up in defense of it.
But you have to acknowledge U.S.-China relations are at a low point.
They're at a difficult point, primarily, in my judgment, for two reasons. We've seen China act more repressively at home in recent years, and we've seen it act more aggressively abroad, beyond its borders. There are a number of areas where we are fundamentally at odds, including China's actions in Xinjiang, with regard to Hong Kong. They say, hey, this is our business, these are internal matters. Actually, no, they're not. China signed on to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. It made solemn commitments to human rights. It's violating those commitments. They have a commitment in the UN Charter to uphold international peace and security. They're undermining the very commitments they made to the international order. That's why we say what we say and do what we do.
In response to the pro-democracy movement in Hong Kong, the Chinese government passed a national security law that bans what it defines as acts of subversion. Now, that law has been used to arrest pro-democracy activists. And this year, electoral changes were passed that critics say could give China even more political power in Hong Kong's government.
The commitments that China made to preserving Hong Kong's democracy are enshrined in a United Nations treaty. What China has done is effectively quash democracy in Hong Kong. And in so doing, it's violated the commitments that it made when Hong Kong was handed over by the British to China, with commitments that were supposed to endure through 2047.
What is the administration going to do about Hong Kong?
Taking action against those directly responsible for quashing democracy in Hong Kong, including through sanctions, including make sure they can't travel to the United States. I think one of the questions is going to be whether Hong Kong is able to sustain itself as an economic and financial center under those conditions. And it may well be that people end up voting with their feet, even if they can't vote at the ballot box. As this continues, companies, people are necessarily going to want to be operating in that environment.
That there'll be an economic blowback.
I think there'll be an economic blowback, and it's going to find it more and more difficult to do that if it's facing the opprobrium of a large part of the world.
Chinese authorities have been detaining Muslim ethnic groups, including Uyghurs, in camps across a region of China called Xinjiang. The Chinese government says they are trying to stop extremism and that the camps are for vocational and Chinese language training. Blinken says it's genocide.
We see a genocide having taken place against the Uyghurs in Xinjiang. More than 1 million people have been put into, choose your term, concentration camps, re-education camps, internment camps. When Beijing says, oh, there's a terrorism threat, which we don't see, it's not coming from 1 million people. We've seen forced sterilization in an effort to hold down birth rates among the Uyghurs, efforts to indoctrinate them, to deny their culture, to deny their heritage, and various repressive and violent actions directed against them because they're Uyghurs. In our judgment, these values are not simply American values. They are universal, and they're pretty basic. So when we see them being violated, it's been our tendency to stand up and say something about it and to try to do something about it, taking action, including sanctions, making sure to the best of our ability that we're not exporting products to China that could be used to repress people, making sure that we're not importing products that are made with slave labor.
Then why not boycott the 2022 Olympics in Beijing?
We're not focused on the question of a boycott at this point. It's just not something that we're looking at. It's a year away.
Is it possible?
Never say something's impossible. It's just not what we're focused on right now.
Secretary Blinken also told us he is working to rebuild relationships with allies across the globe, relationships that had frayed during the previous administration. His message, America's back. What's been the response?
Incredibly positive. I think there's a strong desire to have the United States engaged, to have us leading again, to have us working closely with our partners and allies. When America's on the sidelines, when we're not even in the room, either someone else tries to step up and take our place, and probably not in a way that advances our interests or values, or maybe just as bad, no one does, and then you may have chaos. I found tremendous receptivity to our engagement, to the fact that we're leaning into working, especially with our allies and partners.
As America's top diplomat, what do you feel like you have to rebuild?
One of the things I'm spending a lot of time on is making sure we're strengthening the morale, the trust, the effectiveness of the department by relying on career professionals, by putting them in positions of responsibility, by listening to them, also by making sure that we have a department that actually looks like the country it represents. But the peace abroad is actually engaging with all of our allies and partners, making it clear that we're listening to them, and rebuilding those habits of cooperation that, to some extent, we've gotten away from.